You have no right to be here. I was standing in my own driveway, keys still in my hand, staring at the woman I'd spent 15 years trying to forget, Bethany Crawford, designer sunglasses perched on her head like a crown, clipboard clutched against her chest like armor, that same practiced smile that had convinced me to hand over $18,000 before she vanished into thin air. "Michael," she said, tilting her head with that golden retriever friendliness that made you forget she'd just pissed all over your life. "Oh my God! I thought that was you!" What are the odds? The odds were exactly 0. This wasn't coincidence. This was a nightmare dressed in Ann Taylor and carrying paperwork. It was October 2024, a Tuesday afternoon in rural Virginia, just outside Fredericksburg, where I'd finally built something worth protecting. 40 acres of timber and creek water, a hand-built cabin with a wraparound porch, a fire pit surrounded by Adirondack chairs I'd crafted myself. And now, standing at my gate like she had any business being there, was the woman who'd stolen my future once before. "Bethany," I said flatly. My voice sounded like gravel scraping against metal. "You remember," she chirped like we'd just graduated high school together. "God, Michael, you look exactly the same. Well, maybe a little more rugged. Suits you." I'd changed. 15 years of construction work, failed relationships, and sleeping in my truck had changed me. I'd lost hair, gained scars, buried my father, and watched my sister move to California without saying goodbye. But sure, let's pretend I'm still that gullible 28-year-old who thought people like Bethany were just misunderstood entrepreneurs. She launched into her pitch before I could tell her to leave. She was now president of the Riverside Oaks HOA, the sprawling suburban development that had sprouted up like a fungal infection just south of my property line. Cookie-cutter colonials. Manicured lawns that required more chemicals than a meth lab. The kind of neighborhood where people complained if your mailbox wasn't the approved shade of charcoal gray. The association likes to maintain good relationships with adjacent property owners, she said, her eyes scanning my land like an appraiser calculating loss. You know, just in case there are opportunities for collaboration. Community synergy. There was no synergy. There was my land legally purchased, fully paid off, surrounded by a fence I'd installed myself, and there was theirs, a boundary, both physical and philosophical. "You should really consider joining our community," Bethany continued, stepping closer without invitation. "Your property is stunning. That fire pit, the creek access, the pavilion you built, it's practically a resort. Have you ever thought about event hosting?" I stared at her, not blinking, not responding. "Oh, come on. Don't be like that." She reached out and touched my arm, and I flinched like she'd burned me. I know things ended awkwardly back in Denver, but water under the bridge, right? I always said you were the hardest working guy at that firm. "Yeah," I said, my voice low and cold. "Until you stole 18 grand from me and disappeared." Her smile flickered for exactly half a second. Then came the deflection, smooth as rehearsed lines in a community theater production. "Oh, Michael, you still think that was my fault? That whole startup thing was a disaster for everyone." "Believe me, I lost money too. My brother lost everything. Let's not dwell on ancient history. Ancient history, like theft, has an expiration date. That reunion happened on October 15th, 2024. 3 weeks later, I started noticing her everywhere. A wave as she drove past. A just checking in visit with stale muffins. Questions about my personal life delivered with the curiosity of someone mining for leverage, not making conversation. "How'd you afford this place?" she asked one morning, uninvited, sitting on my porch drinking coffee I hadn't offered her. 40 acres isn't cheap in this area. "Did you ever remarry after... what was her name?" "Jennifer," I said through clenched teeth. "Right. Jennifer? I'm sorry that didn't work out, but look at you now, landowner. Self-made man. You really turned things around." I didn't answer. I just stared toward the creek, imagining her voice being swallowed by the sound of running water. By mid-November, I'd had enough. "You don't need to come here anymore," I told her on a Thursday afternoon after she'd shown up unannounced again. "I'm not interested in the HOA. I'm not interested in small talk. And I'm definitely not interested in whatever angle you're working this time. Her smile twitched, just barely. Then she looked at me like I'd just insulted her mother. I see, she said, straightening her blazer. Well, sorry to bother you. I was just trying to be neighborly. She turned and walked back to her white Lexus SUV without another word. No drama, no confrontation, but something in her eyes said this wasn't over, and 15 years of hard lessons had taught me to believe that, look, 15 years ago, I was a different man. Optimistic, trusting, the kind of person who thought ambition and loyalty could coexist in the same business. Back then, I was working as a project coordinator for a mid-sized consulting firm in Denver. Long hours, decent pay, and I actually believed I was building towards something. Bethany Crawford had transferred from our Austin office in March 2009. She arrived like a force of nature, tailored blazers, infectious laugh, the kind of confidence that made conference rooms feel smaller. Everyone noticed her, including me. At first, we worked well together. She was sharp, unafraid to challenge conventional thinking, willing to stay late on presentations. We'd order Chinese takeout and complain about management. She told me she was saving to start her own consulting firm. I told her I was saving for a down payment on a house. She made entrepreneurship sound like freedom itself. One night over beers at a downtown brewpub, she told me about her brother's tech startup. He's building predictive analytics software for supply chain management, she said, swirling her IPA like it was fine wine. Companies like Amazon are paying millions for this kind of tech. He just needs angel investors, early entry, no corporate red tape. We could triple our investment in a year. I didn't bite immediately. I asked questions. She showed me a pitch deck professional loaded with charts and testimonials. She gave me access to a website with case studies and a polished demo video. Look, she said, leaning forward with an intensity that felt genuine. I've already invested $12,000. If it wasn't legitimate, would I risk that much of my own money? I remember sitting in that bank office signing the withdrawal slip. $18,000. Everything I'd saved for 3 years. I handed her the check, and she hugged me. Actually hugged me, tears in her eyes. You won't regret this, Michael. I promise. The next week, she took 3 days off. Said she was flying to San Francisco to meet with investors and her brother's development team. She came back excited, talking about venture capital interest and beta testing with major retailers. That was the last conversation we ever had about the company. By the end of April, she was gone. HR sent an email. Bethany Crawford had resigned to pursue new opportunities. No forwarding information. Her work phone was disconnected. The website she'd shown me, dead. The email address for her brother's company, bounced. I called the police. They took a report and said it was a civil matter. I contacted a lawyer. Without a contract or business entity, I had no case. Bethany had known exactly what she was doing. I spiraled. Jennifer, my girlfriend of 4 years, had already been frustrated with how much I worked. When I told her what happened, that I'd lost our down payment to a colleague I'd trusted, she looked at me like I'd betrayed her. No yelling, no theatrics. Just a quiet, devastating. I can't do this anymore. She moved out within 2 weeks. I started drinking, not to rage, just to numb myself enough to sleep, without replaying that moment in the bank over and over. I ended up couch surfing with friends who grew tired of my company. I lived in my car for a while, parked behind a 24-hour fitness center, showering in their locker room. Rock bottom didn't feel dramatic. It felt like white noise. But somewhere in that collapse, I found something harder than ambition. I found anger that clarified into purpose. I started working construction, framing houses, pouring concrete, learning to build with my hands. The work was brutal, but it was honest. No pitch decks, no promises, just labor and paychecks. Dollar by dollar, I clawed back. I saved. I bought land in rural Virginia for cash 40 acres nobody wanted because it was too far from everything. I built my cabin myself over 2 years, living in a camper while I worked. Every nail I drove with Bethany's name in the back of my mind. So when I saw her again 15 years later, standing on my property acting like we were old friends, I didn't feel rage. I felt recognition. The kind of clarity you get right before a storm hits. It was 3 days after I'd told Bethany to stop visiting that she showed up again. This time, she was wearing a cream-colored dress, full makeup at 9 in the morning, and holding a wedding invitation like it was a golden ticket. "Michael," she called out, already halfway up my driveway before I could retreat inside. "I know you said you needed space, but this is urgent. Really urgent." I stood on my porch, arms crossed, blocking the steps. That should have communicated everything. But Bethany pressed forward, waving the invitation like a white flag. "My daughter is getting married," she announced breathlessly, "and the venue we booked, the historic inn on Route 17, had a pipe burst 2 days ago, total flooding. The wedding is this Saturday, and we have nowhere to go." I blinked. "I'm sorry to hear that, but what does that have to do with me?" Bethany laughed like I'd missed an obvious punchline. "Michael, your property is perfect. The creek, the pavilion, that stone fire pit, it's like something out of a magazine. We used to be close. You're not using the space right just for one afternoon. We'll bring everything in, take everything out. You won't lift a finger." I stared at her, genuinely stunned that she thought this was reasonable. "No," I said. Her smile dropped half an inch. "Wait, what do you mean, no?" "No! You want to put 150 people on my land next to my creek and pretend we're friends because it's convenient? I told you not to come back here." The smile was completely gone now. She looked shocked, like I'd violated some unspoken rule. "You're seriously saying no?" she asked, as if refusal wasn't an option. "After everything we've been through?" "Especially after everything," I said. There was a long silence. Her lips parted, then closed, then parted again. "Well," she said finally, straightening her posture like she was preparing for a board meeting, "you've changed, Michael, and not for the better." She turned and walked back to her Lexus. I watched her drive away, tires spitting gravel. That should have been the end. But the next day, I had to drive to Richmond for a consultation meeting about a commercial build project I was subcontracting on. It was supposed to be a quick one-day trip. I left Friday morning and planned to be back Saturday evening. The meeting ran long, then drinks with the general contractor, then an issue with the blueprints that required another session Saturday morning. I ended up booking a motel room that smelled like cigarettes and pine sol. Saturday afternoon, while I was sitting in traffic on I-95 heading home, my phone exploded with alerts. Motion detected. Multiple zones. Every security camera on my property was lighting up. I opened the app and felt my blood pressure spike into dangerous territory. Tense. White folding chairs arranged in rows. A buffet table under my pavilion. String lights hung between trees I'd planted myself. And people, dozens of them. Maybe more than 100. Women in pastel dresses. Men in suits. Children running through my wildflower meadow. Music blasting from rented speakers positioned near my fire pit. Standing in the center of it all, holding a microphone and beaming like a game show host, was Bethany Crawford. She wore a champagne-colored gown and was toasting to her daughter's happiness on my land. I almost threw the phone through the windshield. I called her. Straight to voicemail. I called the county sheriff. They said they couldn't act without me being present to file a formal trespass complaint. I watched the rest of it unfold through my phone like a horror movie. I couldn't pause. Someone spilled red wine on the stone steps leading down to the creek. A kid fell into the water. A portable generator caught fire briefly near the tree line. At one point, I watched a drunk groomsman urinate behind my storage shed. When I finally got home Sunday morning, the damage hit harder than the footage. Trash bags overflowing under the trees. Cigarette butts ground into the grass, footprints through the flower beds. My pavilion's railing was cracked. One of my security cameras had been ripped off its mount and tossed into the creek. And the kicker? A just married banner was still tangled in the oak tree, like a middle finger from fate itself. That afternoon, while I stood surveying the wreckage, Bethany showed up. Not embarrassed, not apologetic, smug. "Well," she said, stepping over a discarded wine bottle. "It turned out beautifully, didn't it?" I didn't answer. I didn't trust myself to speak. She walked past me like she owned the place. "I figured you'd be okay with it once you saw how perfect it was. I mean, come on, you weren't even using the space." I turned to her slowly. "I told you no." Bethany put a hand on her hip. "You didn't answer your phone. I assumed something came up and you changed your mind. I was out of town. You knew that." She shrugged. "Look, don't be so dramatic. We cleaned up most of it. It was just one afternoon, Michael. You didn't have to be so selfish about it." She turned to leave, completely unbothered, like she'd just borrowed a cup of sugar. And that's when I realized Bethany wasn't sorry. She wasn't embarrassed. She thought this was a victory, and she was about to learn just how badly she'd miscalculated. I filed the police report Monday morning. Not an hour after pulling cigarette butts from my flower beds, I drove to the Spotsylvania County Sheriff's Office and handed over my security footage with the calmest voice I could manage without screaming. The deputy, a stocky guy in his 40s with kind eyes, watched the footage with a professional frown and nodded along like he'd seen this before. "So they held a wedding on your land?" he said, "without any written agreement or permission. There wasn't even verbal permission," I told him. I said no, point blank, on camera. "Well, that makes this trespassing and property damage," he said. "We'll file the report. You're doing the right thing." I walked out of that office thinking maybe, finally, someone with authority would take this seriously. 2 days later, Bethany showed up at the sheriff's office herself. She brought a lawyer, a man in an expensive Navy suit with perfect teeth and a briefcase that probably cost more than my truck. Bethany told the deputy we were old friends and that I'd given informal consent for the event. That I'd seemed receptive when she'd mentioned it, and that this was all a misunderstanding between neighbors. Informal consent. Like I'd nodded politely, and she took that as legal permission to throw a 150-person party on my property. The deputy called me 2 days later. "Mr. Brennan, we've got conflicting testimony here. Without more documentation, we can't move forward with criminal charges right now, but you're free to pursue civil action." Civil action. Great. Translation: if you want justice, you'll have to pay for it yourself. That's when I called Sarah Harding. I'd met her 2 years earlier at a county planning meeting where she'd eviscerated a developer trying to bypass environmental regulations. Smart, sharp, willing to fight. Turned out she was a civil litigation attorney with a strong track record in property rights cases, and by some cosmic irony, she'd also known Bethany Crawford back in college. "I never trusted her," Sarah said during our first meeting at a coffee shop in Fredericksburg. "She's the type who sharpens her smile before she stabs you." I laid out everything. The footage, the property survey, the police report showing I'd filed complaints. Sarah listened, asked precise questions, took notes on her tablet. Then she sat back and said, "She's hiding something bigger than this wedding. I can smell it." The next day, I got a letter in my mailbox. Not certified mail, not signed by any official authority. Just a passive-aggressive printed notice on Riverside Oaks HOA letterhead. "Dear adjacent property owner, it has come to our attention that your land may have unresolved historical ties to the Crawford family estate. See HOA Historical Boundary Review File, Has-Height 47. You are advised to review your deed for possible easement clauses related to community access. Failure to comply may result in formal review and potential injunction." Crawford family. That name hit me like ice water. Sarah did some digging through county records. Turned out Bethany's maiden name was Crawford. Her grandmother, Eleanor Crawford, had owned a large farm in this area back in the 1962. The property was subdivided and sold off after Eleanor died in 1998. Sarah and I requested the full public land transaction records. 2 days later, Bethany knocked on my door holding a manila folder and wearing an expression of practiced concern. "I thought I should come by," she said. "Given all this tension between us, I found something that might help." I didn't invite her in, just waited. "Turns out," she said, pulling out yellowed documents, "my grandmother Eleanor had a provision in her estate documents." It granted perpetual access to family members for gatherings and celebrations on any land that was originally part of her farm, since your 40 acres were part of that original property. She smiled like a magician, revealing the finale. Well, I guess that makes it shared access. I took the papers without a word. Sarah met me at a diner an hour later. She examined the documents under the fluorescent lights, running her finger along the text and checking the notary stamps. "This is fake," she said. "How can you tell?" Sarah held up the page to the light. "Look at the paper quality. This isn't 1997 stationery, it's modern laser printer stock. The font is Times New Roman, which wasn't standard for legal documents in Virginia in the 92nds. And this notary seal? It's a digital copy-paste. Sloppy forgery." We filed for a forensic document analysis that same day. Sarah also requested full access to the county land registry going back to 1960. If Bethany was dumb enough to forge estate documents, who knew what else we'd find? Meanwhile, Bethany started working her network. At HOA meetings, she began spreading rumors that I was unstable, that I'd verbally agreed to the wedding, and that I was now trying to extort her through lawyers. Funny how people who abuse others always think accountability is abuse. Someone drove by my property one night and threw eggs at my gate. I found a Facebook post from one of Bethany's HOA friends claiming I was suing a grieving mother for being generous. Sarah just laughed when I showed her. Good, let them talk. The more public it gets, the more mistakes they'll make. But me? I wasn't laughing. Not yet. 2 weeks later, the forensic report came back. Seeing the words inauthentic document, digitally manipulated signatures, and inconsistent paper aging printed in official language gave me a rush I hadn't felt in years. Not joy, something colder. Justice putting on its work boots, Sarah compiled a preliminary case file that could have crushed a small animal, copies of the forged estate papers, side-by-side comparisons with actual Eleanor Crawford land records, expert testimony from the document analyst. We now had more than just trespassing. We had fraud, attempted land, misappropriation, and possibly tax evasion if Bethany had profited from renting land she didn't own. "Let's go civil first," Sarah said, tapping her pen against her notepad. "Establish damages, force discovery. Then we refer the forgery to the DA for criminal prosecution." We filed a civil lawsuit in Spotsylvania County Circuit Court, trespassing, unauthorized commercial use of private property, property damage, emotional distress, and fraud related to the forged estate documents. Bethany was served during a Riverside Oaks HOA board meeting. A neighbor told me later that her hand shook so badly the papers rattled when she grabbed them. That same evening, Sarah got a call from a paralegal who worked with one of the wedding vendors, the photographer to be exact. "I thought you should know," the paralegal said. Bethany Crawford charged the bride's family a venue fee, $11,000. She told them it was her family property and she had exclusive rights to host events there. We tracked down the caterer, the DJ, the florist. All told, Bethany had collected nearly $19,000 for venue rental of my land. She'd used my creek, my pavilion, my electricity. Someone had even connected to my well pump to fill portable water tanks. This wasn't just a wedding anymore, it was a business operation. Sarah amended our lawsuit to include unjust enrichment, fraudulent representation, and commercial theft. Bethany's lawyer responded with a letter dripping with condescension. Miss Crawford acted in good faith based on historical family access. The wedding was a one-time private event. Mr. Brennan is overreacting. Sarah smiled as she read it. They're scared. This response screams panic. But Bethany wasn't going down quietly. The morning after our lawsuit became public record, I woke up to find 2 county code enforcement officers at my gate holding clipboards and very specific complaints. Anonymous tip, one of them said, not meeting my eyes. Says, you might have unpermitted structures, pavilion without proper permits, possible septic violations, potentially running a commercial event space without zoning approval. Sarah laughed when I called her. Classic Bethany. When cornered, weaponize bureaucracy. She arrived the next morning with every permit, receipt, and inspection certificate I'd ever filed. We walked the officers through every corner of the property. By the end, they were smiling and shaking their heads. "Everything's in order," one said. "Better documented than most properties in the county." That evening, I sat on my porch with a beer, watching the sun set behind the tree line. For the first time in weeks, I felt like the hunter instead of the hunted. Then Sarah called. "Check your email. You're going to want to see this." It was a forwarded letter from the IRS, anonymous tip regarding Bethany Crawford. Multiple undeclared event rental payments. Possible tax evasion on income exceeding $15,000. Sarah's voice was calm, but I could hear the satisfaction underneath. "Turns out your snake might have been stealing from Uncle Sam, too." I leaned back in my chair and took a long drink. Somewhere across the county, Bethany was probably pacing her kitchen, wondering how everything had unraveled so fast. But it hadn't unraveled. It had just started tightening like a noose she'd tied herself. The courthouse in Spotsylvania smelled like old wood and floor wax. It wasn't my first time in a courtroom, but it was the first time I felt like I might actually win something. Sarah stood beside me, looking sharp in a charcoal suit, carrying a leather briefcase that radiated competence. Across the aisle sat Bethany, polished and poised, wearing a navy dress that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage back in Denver. Her lawyer was a tall man in his 50s, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The gallery was surprisingly full. HOA board members, curious neighbors, even a reporter from the Fredericksburg Freelance Star. I caught a glimpse of the wedding photographer. She didn't wave, but the small nod she gave me was enough. The judge was a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We're here regarding Brennan versus Crawford," she said. "Claims of trespass, fraud, property damage, and illegal commercial activity. Let's proceed." Bethany's lawyer opened with a sob story about how his client was simply trying to save her daughter's wedding during a crisis, how there had been confusion about property boundaries, how I had once been friendly and may have given informal permission. Sarah leaned forward calmly and handed the judge a printed transcript of my security footage, timestamps, clearly showing me telling Bethany, "No," multiple times. Then she dropped the forensic report on the judge's bench like it weighed 20 pounds. "Your Honor, the defendant submitted falsified estate documents to imply ownership interest in Mr. Brennan's property. Expert analysis confirms these documents were forged using modern digital tools and counterfeit notary seals." Bethany's expression flickered. That practiced confidence was cracking. Sarah wasn't finished. Next came the vendor receipts, caterer, DJ, photographer, florist, all showing payments made directly to Bethany Crawford for venue rental. Then Sarah played a video clip from a wedding guest's Instagram story. The camera panned across my pavilion with Bethany clearly visible in the background, saying, "I always knew this property would make the perfect venue. It's been in my family for generations." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Miss Crawford, did you collect payment for use of this land?" Bethany stood, her voice softer than usual, almost trembling. I may have accepted contributions to cover costs, but only because I believed I had legitimate family access rights. My grandmother owned that property." There was a provision Sarah cut in smoothly with the judge's permission. "There is no provision, Your Honor. We obtained complete transaction records from 1960 to present. Eleanor Crawford sold her farm in 1998. It has no current connection to Miss Crawford. The estate documents she submitted to this court are fabrications." Bethany's lawyer objected weakly, overruled. Then came the IRS notice. Sarah read it aloud, slow and clear. Formal inquiry regarding undeclared income from private event rentals, totaling approximately $19,000 over the past 18 months. The courtroom murmured. Bethany's shoulders tensed, like cables about to snap. Sarah finished with one more document, a letter from a former Riverside Oaks HOA board member who'd resigned after discovering that Bethany had used her position to approve projects that conveniently increased her own property value, many funded with HOA dues. The judge called a 30-minute recess. When we returned, Everything had changed. Bethany looked smaller. Her makeup was smudged. Her lawyer looked defeated. The judge's ruling was clear and devastating. The court finds in favor of plaintiff Michael Brennan. Defendant Bethany Crawford is ordered to pay $68,000 in damages, restitution for trespassing, property repairs, emotional distress, and disgorgement of profits earned through fraudulent representation. Gasps rippled through the gallery. As to the forged estate documents, the judge continued, voice hardening, this court refers the matter to the Commonwealth's Attorney for Criminal Investigation. Forgery of legal documents is a felony in Virginia. Miss Crawford, you should expect contact from law enforcement. Bethany's face drained of color. Her lawyer remained seated, motionless. We walked out into November sunshine. Reporters called my name. I said nothing. Sarah simply smiled and steered me toward her car. A Riverside Oaks board member approached us in the parking lot, a middle-aged man with gray hair and genuine remorse in his eyes. We're removing her as president, he said. Emergency vote happened last night. And for what it's worth, a lot of us had no idea what kind of person we were following. I nodded but didn't say much. Justice doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes it's just the sound of a gavel and the quiet realization that no one is above the law they tried to step over. 4 months passed. Winter gave way to early spring in rural Virginia. I didn't rush to change anything about the property. The pavilion still had faint scorch marks from the wedding generator fire. I left them there on purpose, like scars that had healed but still told a story. Bethany was no longer the queen of Riverside Oaks. Word spread through the county like wildfire. First about the civil judgment, then about the criminal charges, fraud, document forgery, tax evasion. I didn't celebrate when I heard she'd taken a plea deal, 18 months in minimum security, 5 years probation, full restitution. I didn't need to celebrate. Justice had already done its work. She'd go away for a while. Maybe come back humbled, maybe not come back at all. But here's what happened that I didn't expect. Her downfall opened a door I'd thought was permanently closed. Sarah Harding started coming around more often after the case wrapped. Sometimes with case follow-up questions, sometimes just to talk. Turned out she had a small farm of her own, about 20 miles south. We traded advice about fencing and, well, pumps. Then started trading texts that had nothing to do with lawsuits. Then dinner. Then more dinners. It wasn't fast, it wasn't dramatic, it was just right, two people who'd both been burned, finding something quiet and real in the aftermath. One evening, in late March 2025, she sat next to me on the porch, barefoot, in jeans, drinking wine from a mason jar. We didn't talk much, just listened to the creek and the evening birds. You ever think you'd end up here? She asked. I looked out at the land I'd built with my own hands. Not like this, but maybe this is where I was always supposed to end up. 3 months later, I proposed. Not with fanfare, just with a simple question and a handmade wooden box containing my grandmother's ring. She said yes. Simple. Solid. We got married in October 2025 under the same oak tree where Bethany's just married banner had once hung. This time, the banner was ours. We invited close friends and family. The photographer from the fraudulent wedding came bringing flowers at her own expense and apologizing for not speaking up sooner. The former HOA president came with a bottle of bourbon. Even the deputy who'd taken my initial police report showed up in civilian clothes. As the sun went down, string lights blinked on around the pavilion. Sarah's idea. Closure, she said. Reclaiming this space. And maybe that was the real victory. Not the money, not the criminal conviction, but taking back what had been violated and filling it with something genuine. Later that night, after the music had stopped and everyone had gone, I stood alone under that oak tree, holding Sarah's shoes in one hand and my tie in the other, for the first time in 15 years. I wasn't angry. I wasn't haunted by what I'd lost in Denver. I was just here, present, whole. And damn if that wasn't enough. Years ago, Bethany Crawford had stolen my savings and my trust. She'd taught me that some people will smile while they rob you blind. But she'd also taught me something else. That you can rebuild from nothing if you're willing to work for it. That justice might be slow, but it's real if you document everything and refuse to give up. The land I'd built, the woman I'd married, the peace I'd fought for. None of it would exist without that original betrayal pushing me towards something harder and more honest than I'd been before. I'm not grateful to Bethany, but I'm grateful for who I became in spite of her. And I'm grateful that when she came back trying to take something else, I was ready, not with anger, with evidence, with patience, with the law. Proof beats power. Truth outlasts lies. And sometimes the people who hurt you end up teaching you exactly what you needed to learn. The creek kept running, the trees kept growing, and I kept building not just property, but a life that no one could take away. That's the real victory. Not revenge, just refusal to stay broken. And that, in the end, is enough. The end.